we like. Is the government and the financial regulator getting soft on banks? That's the fear among some MPs after the city watchdog announced that it was shelving a review into banking culture. It was the culture that many people thought helped create the crisis in 2008. MPs on the Treasury Select Committee have summoned the bosses of the Financial Conduct Authority, the FCA, which was carrying out the review, to give evidence later this month to explain the move. Now, Chancellor Osborne says he had no prior knowledge of the decision. But more broadly, is the government shifting its tone towards the banking industry? In June, shortly after the general election, Chancellor Osborne made his speech to the top bankers at the Mansion House in London, as he does every year. He said this time, quote, "Our financial services industry in Britain has in recent years been seen as part of the problem. Now it must become part of the solution." Then in July, in his emergency budget, or his post-election budget, the Chancellor took further action by reducing the bank levy and replacing it with a less onerous charge on domestic profits. Before the election, HSBC, by far the biggest bank now in Britain, declared that the bank levy was a factor in its ongoing deliberation whether to move its headquarters out of the United Kingdom, perhaps to Hong Kong. Later that month, Martin Wheatley, he's the chief executive of this city watchdog, the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, he was forced out of his job. He wasn't popular with city bosses. Mr. Wheatley, in fact, was pretty unpopular with them. For example, in 2014-15, the watchdog under his watch raised $1.4 billion in fines on banks and other financial institutions, more than in the previous 4 years combined. And just last month, the FCA revealed that it had shelved plans for this inquiry into the culture, the pay, and the behaviour of banking staff. The chairman of the Commons Select Committee is Andrew Tyree. He said that recent decisions by the FCA were given the impression of a weakening of resolve. Mr. Tyree is a Tory. George Osborne was asked about that yesterday on the BBC. Here's what he had to say.
That was a completely independent decision that I had no foreknowledge of.
What do you think of it?
No advance warning of. But it's got to be an independent decision for our banking regulator.
Oh, come on, you're the Chancellor, though. You must have a view as to whether there should be that sort of investigation into the way the banks have been behaving.
Well, I would say that we did have that investigation. It was a cross-party parliamentary commission that included people like the Archbishop of Canterbury on it.
And we've been joined from Sheffield by Labour MP John Mann. He's on this Treasury Select Committee, one of the more powerful select committees in the Commons. And in the studio, stockbroker market commentator David Bury. I should say that we did ask the Treasury for an interview with the government minister on this, but to our surprise and indeed horror, no one was available. David Bury, is the government changing its attitude to the banking industry now?
I don't think so, Andrew. I think it's a question of pragmatism. We've come a long way since John McFall's committee, Treasury Select Committee, after the financial crisis.
He was the Labour MP who chaired it under the last Labour government.
John Mann played a very leading role and a very vociferous role and a very good role. And the level of regulation that we had then was soft, and it was a shambles. And the FSA was a shambles, and the government didn't seem to know what was going on. And an awful lot of water's passed under the bridge, a lot of change of personalities. I believe the situation now that Andrew Bailey is responsible for prudential banking, he has the great respect of the entire industry. He's a very good communicator.
Right, but that's what the regulations are, and the regulations have changed. Of course, we won't know if they're the right regulations until we hit the next crisis. You never do. But are we really sure that the culture's changed all that much? Are we really sure that a lot of the kind of culture that created the crisis in 2007-8 is still not there?
I absolutely think the changes have been implemented, because a lot of this stuff that's come up, the PPI stuff, the LIBOR stuff, you're going to see an enormous number of court cases in the next 3 to 6 months where people are going to serve, if they're found guilty, long prison sentences for which they deserve for their misdemeanors.
Every time I'm told that by somebody in the city, another scandal erupts.
Yes, but many of them, Andrew, with great respect, are historical, and it takes a long time to bring these people to book. And as far as I'm concerned, Tracy McDermott has done a fantastic job.
And she is
basically the temporary head of the FCA until somebody is appointed. And she won't mind me saying this, she is a Rottweiler, and she's a brilliant one.
Okay.
And
so why doesn't the government give it her full time?
she doesn't want to.
Doesn't want it?
No. So
maybe she knows something that we don't.
No.
Let me go to John Mann. John, the Treasury Select Committee is going to bring in the bosses of the FCA to find out why this inquiry was shelved. What do you think at the moment is going on?
Well, we know what's going on. Up to August, the FCA had a huge amount of work ongoing into culture within banks and how to ensure that the culture was appropriate. In September, Martin Wheatley left, and instantly all that work was changed. Not just one piece of work, but lots of pieces of work that have been going on for some years. Every single bit of it dropped. In essence, the FCA will have no point for existing.
But since the FCA is, we are told, an independent regulatory authority, why would it drop this inquiry into culture, even if the government wanted it? The government, as I would understand it, has no power to tell it to stop doing it.
Well, it's my belief that the government has interfered. I think our inquiry will prove that, hopefully prove precisely how they've interfered. The FCA hasn't reached its own conclusions. It's been told what to do. It's been told via the Treasury. And it's a bit weaselly for George Osborne to say, I had no prior knowledge. We can define that as saying, I personally wasn't informed, because the way I operate is that they don't inform me of those things. It's nod and a wink. His officials knew what was going on, and I predict that he wants one of his senior officials to in fact run the FCA to complete the job for him, which is to neuter it.
So you believe that, contrary to what Mr. Osborne told the BBC this week, you believe that the government was involved on, if I put it this way, pressuring the FCA not to proceed with this inquiry?
Directly and specifically, not just generally, but specifically. And I think that the Treasury Committee inquiry will uncover how that happened. And it's a huge scandal in terms of the approach of the government, not least because they're saying one thing publicly, as Osborne did, but doing something else privately, but also the motives for doing it. And in my view, George Osborne's motive is to maximise the income he gets back in from selling off shares in RBS and Lloyds. That's what this is about, because the economy isn't going as well as he wants, and his projections, which he gets independently from the OBR, are not going to be that good with his March budget and later this year. He wants to compensate for that.
Right. Now, it's obviously a very important and serious accusation that you're saying the government did lead on this, and it'll be fascinating to see the evidence, because obviously the Treasury is saying that isn't what would happen, but governments often say things that turn out to be true. Let me ask you this question though. Given that your inquiry hasn't yet started, your inquiry into the lack of an inquiry, which is what you're about to do, how do you know all this?
Because when we've had the FCA in front of us before, we're aware of what their work programme has been and their priorities. And it's not just this one inquiry that they were doing into culture and the work on that. It's a series of things that they've dropped. Some things have been announced. I believe there are other pieces of work that have been dropped that were very important internally in the FCA that have disappeared, stopped, ended. This is a huge change in regulation. And in essence, what has happened is that the prudential regulator, the PRA, under Mr. Bailey, which looks at the grand picture, that's continuing its work. But the precise regulation of individual banks and individual bankers has come to an end. It's self-regulation now for individual banks.
All right.
That's a huge approach that has not been agreed by Parliament, and I don't believe there's a consensus in the country that it's right to do that.
Let me put that. What's your response to David Hughes?
Well, obviously John Mann is privileged to information that I don't get. But the way I read it is that Andrew Bailey at the Prudential Banking Authority has a very close relationship with the FCA. And banks have transgressed. Nobody's trying to get away from that.
I understand.
But they have been rubbished to a degree where it's counterproductive to recovery. And I think Andrew Bailey and his meetings with the FCA have probably decided that the work in terms of dealing with the behavioural factor or the poor behaviour of the bank should be done individually by each bank reporting. Now, John Mann can summon whoever he likes, or Andrew Tyree as the chairman, to ask for an explanation, and I think they're highly entitled to do so. But I believe that you deal with one individual bank, each one in this country,
right,
on an individual basis.
Well,
you'll get a much better result in the long term.
But would it not be fair to surmise that the government has taken fright at the prospect of HSBC moving its headquarters from London? It's by far the biggest bank, even though most of its operations are not in this country. And indeed, we learn that the FCA is shelving, is not pursuing action against HSBC over its Swiss private banking arm, which was such a scandal last year. Again, that was HSBC. You could put together a case to say that the government is kind of in retreat from the banks now.
You could, and it doesn't look terribly good. But what I'm saying to you is that I believe that within the portals of the Bank of England and all the regulatory authorities, they have a duty of care to make sure that the banking fraternity works as well as it possibly can. Now, it is a matter of wholesale indifference to Douglas Flint and to Stuart Gulliver, the chairman and chief executive of HSBC, whether they have their head office in London or not, because they can go pretty much anywhere. 70% of their business is done away from London.
But it would be a huge reputational damage to the government if a conservative government was to lose HSBC.
Andrew, it's more than that. It would be a huge reputational damage to the City of London. And the City of London and the financial sector contribute about 15% of GDP. That's why I've said at the beginning of my comments, I believe this is a pragmatic approach. John Mann and his Treasury Select Committee have every right to have the drains up and see why they've come around with these decisions. But I actually happen to think that it's been done with the best interest of everybody's heart, in the full knowledge that the FCA will bring transgressors to book in a very serious manner, and you'll find this out in the next 3 to 6 months when loads of people are going to go to jail.
Unless you're HSBC's Swiss banking arm. John Mann, I'll give you the final word.
Mr. Buick was exactly right that what should happen is each bank is properly regulated individually. That is exactly the change that's taking place. That's the regulation that's not going to happen. It's all going to be generalised. Risk to the whole system. Mr. Bailey's role in it and the PRA. The regulator, the FCA, will in essence have no effective role whatsoever in the future. It's a huge change. We need to expose that and have a proper debate about whether that decision, inspired by Osborne and the Treasury, is the right one. Obviously, I don't think it is.
I understand. Mr. Mann, just very briefly, finally, when do you expect to have the FCA in front of your Select Committee?
Oh, it's this month. I also hope and think we'll have Mr. Osborne and perhaps other Treasury officials as well.
Come back and talk to us after you've had these meetings?
Will do.
Thank you, John Mann. Thank you very much, David Hewitt. Come back and talk to us as well. It's good to have you both on this developing story that the daily politics will obviously be covering. This week.